Hello YouTube, and welcome to my new series, which I like to call Flipping Tables. This series will reveal major and minor one-time events that did or didn't take place in the development of a war or civilization, and we will explore into them to see what happened had they been enacted or discarded. I've chosen the topic of World War II for the first episode, as it was a war full of small plans and operations which did, or would have led to, a completely different outcome for the war. There are 7 for this episode. Number 1 is Operation Mincemeat and Operation XX. Number 2 is Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. Number 3 is cracking Enigma. Number 4 is the possibility of Pearl Harbor never actually happening. Number 5 is the Norwegian raid of the German heavy water plant. Number 6 is the Germans attacking the British over the Soviets. And number 7, the Germans attacking the Swiss. The way that each of these will be discussed is through a quick summary of what each event was, and then we will enter into the alternate scenario of the event. To begin, we'll talk about Enigma. Enigma was an incredible encryption device, using routers and complicated algorithms to encrypt German messages. Yet due to the arrogance of the Germans maintaining it, it was eventually cracked by the Polish and the British. Had the Germans been more attentive with it, it is said that they wouldn't have been able to crack it until much later, if at all. Now, what would have happened? Had Enigma never been cracked, the Allied forces would have had much more difficulty advancing throughout the war. The greatest breakthrough was the U-boat Enigma crack, which led to a faster D-Day invasion. Had D-Day been delayed, Hitler would have been able to prepare himself for the assault, leading to an even more catastrophic battle at D-Day. The war would have easily lasted much longer. Assuming that D-Day is delayed, the Germans would have been able to prepare defenses throughout all of Germany and France for the inevitable American assault. This would result in American casualties nearly twice than with Enigma cracked. In fact, the Americans would eventually use the atomic bomb on the Germans, perhaps in Berlin, killing millions of civilians and destroying one of Europe's greatest cities. Overall, had Enigma remained unbroken, the war against the Nazi regime would have been much more catastrophic and deadly for all. Now, we'll move on to Cherry Blossoms at Night. Cherry Blossoms at Night was a major chemical attack to be carried out by Unit 731 on the west coast of the United States. It was planned to be carried out via submarine aircraft carriers, which carried plague-infected fleas to wipe out the west coast. Cherry Blossoms at Night was planned for September 1945. The Americans used the atomic bomb just a month before, leading to the surrender of the Japanese. Now, what would have happened? Cherry Blossoms at Night would have been viewed as one of the worst events in the entire World War, killing thousands. However, it would not have wiped out the entire western coast, as some may believe, due to the American precautions such as gas masks. Nonetheless, there would have been a multitude of casualties for America, perhaps redirecting more forces toward the Japanese. In fact, it's reasonable to think that America would redirect nearly all of the American forces of Europe to Japan. The reasoning? Well, the only way Japan would have been able to do this is if nuclear bombs had either been developed slower or not at all. Therefore, the Americans couldn't just end the war with one simple weapon. And of course, considering the anger of America towards Japan and the state of the European war at the time, the Americans would likely redirect. This would prove to be mostly a mistake, as the Germans would realize they are not surrounded anymore. This would have led Hitler to not commit suicide and instead flee throughout the western half of Germany until the Soviets would surround him, or the Americans were to return to Europe after they had defeated the Japanese. Now, what makes me think the Americans would have defeated the Japanese? Firebombing, simply put. The Americans were firebombing Japanese islands well before the nuclear bomb was used. However, the firebombing process was slow and couldn't just be done by a simple flyby. The American forces would have needed to siege Japan itself, which would have led to a much more devastating war. The firebombing of Japan, as well as the invasion of Japan by American forces, would have eventually caused Japan to surrender. Overall, Cherry Blossoms at Night would have caused an anger America, which would have led to the war to last many more years, perhaps 5 to 10 at the least. Casualties would have also skyrocketed for the Americans and the Japanese. Now, we shall move on to Operation Mincemeat and Operation Double Cross. These two operations were counter-espionage operations that involved the British government deceiving the Germans to use falsified information to set up their defenses and attack plans. Operation Double Cross was an attempt to make the Germans believe they were directly destroying London with their artillery through fake documents spread to the staff, including German spies. However, the artillery was actually a few degrees latitude off from London. The Germans never corrected their aim, therefore sparing London from complete and utter destruction. Operation Mincemeat was another disinformation operation by British forces, which involved planting fake top-secret information on a deceased body off the coast of Spain. The Germans found the body and took it to be illegitimate. The documents stated that the Allies planned to assault Greece and Sardinia, however the Allies intended to attack Sicily, which allowed for the success of the attack. Now, what would have happened? Had these deception operations either failed or never been carried out, losses would have been disastrous for London and all of Britain. London would have been entirely destroyed by Germany, considering that the Germans bombed it throughout the entire war, and would have done the same in this scenario, or until they believed London was destroyed. This would have led to oblivious civilian deaths and a lowered morale of British forces, perhaps slowing down the advance of North Africa and Europe. Without mincemeat, German forces would likely have been able to defend the British assault on Sicily much more efficiently, perhaps putting a halt to it. Mincemeat also allowed for the possibility of Operation Market Garden and the misplacement of German troops during D-Day, as German soldiers found documentation containing crucial information about the plans for both these operations, yet the Germans discarded them as they believed it was another trap. Had mincemeat failed, the Germans would have no reason to discard the documents, and Market Garden would have been an even more devastating failure for the Allies, and D-Day would have been even more difficult. The decisiveness of the British was a key aspect to their success. They were able to fool Germany to move their men into all the wrong places and fire in all the wrong areas. Without this, the war in Europe would have been much more difficult for Great Britain. Now we'll move on to the possibility of Pearl Harbor not actually happening. The bombardment of Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7th, 1941, by the Imperial Japanese Army, which caused the United States to declare war on the Japanese to retaliate, at which point America officially entered World War II. The attack was devastating for the base, with 2,400 men killed and another 1,000 wounded. Nearly all aircraft were either destroyed or damaged. The bombardment of Pearl Harbor was especially disliked by Hitler, surprisingly, as he was unprepared for a new enemy and he purely underestimated the new force. What would have happened? Had the assault never taken place, the United States would have most likely remained neutral throughout the war. Without American assistance, Britain would have severely struggled to make major territorial gains in Western Nazi territory, yet they would have still maintained air dominance, which would have prevented a raid on England, as Hitler wanted air superiority before he invaded. Therefore, the only offensive against the Third Reich would have been the Russians, assisted by the British, which would have been damaging nonetheless. However, the Japanese would have soon attacked the Russians in eastern Siberia, no doubt. For had they not attacked America, it can be assumed that the Japanese wanted the first major military engagement to be against the Soviets. Therefore, they'd finish capturing the Pacific Islands, then immediately engage Russia. With Russia surrounded, it'd be impossible for Stalin to defend. After years of fighting, the Russians would eventually surrender and hand over the territory to the Axis powers. With Russia defeated, the Americans would realize that world domination by the Axis powers would be imminent unless they joined the war. The Americans would then sadly realize that they were far too late, and, throughout years of endless fighting, the Axis powers would defeat America, Britain, and any other military force that would uprise, due to the momentum the Axis forces would gain from capturing so much land and so many people. This, of course, is the worst possible way the world could suffer without a Pearl Harbor. However, at the very least, America would join later into the war than they originally did, which would result in many more casualties and extend the war for many more years. Now we'll move on to the Norwegian sabotage of the heavy water plant, owned by the Nazis. Few realize that the Norwegian sabotage of Germany's heavy water plantation was what ended Hitler's hope of the atomic bomb. The heavy water plant was used by German scientists in an attempt to see if heavy water could be used as an alternate to uranium to produce atomic weapons. However, during the Germans' research, Norwegians invaded the plant and destroyed it by 1943, therefore stopping the research and production of it altogether, as it was the only heavy water plant at the time. This later proved to be the end for the all atomic bomb production in Germany, as was revealed by the end of the war. Now, what would have happened? Had Germany either survived or retaliated on the attacks, kept the plant mass-producing heavy water for Germany, the Germans would have most likely had the first operational atomic bomb long before the Americans did. By late 1944, the Germans would have an atomic bomb ready for war, as they are the most scientifically advanced country in Europe, and they would have likely launched it against Moscow, as they thought London to be destroyed. With the destruction of Moscow, Soviet morale and leadership would be eradicated, and they would likely surrender. The British and the Americans, however, would not surrender as fast. Knowing that Germany would aim for England next, the British would hastily develop defenses against nuclear bombs and would likely succeed due to their air superiority. The Americans would soon follow Germany in nuclear development, and all-out nuclear war would pursue. This sabotage in the war is truly the most overlooked, as it could have caused world annihilation and apocalypse had the German plant survived. This is in fact one of the best examples for the Flippin Tables series, as it's just a small event that the war crucially needed. Now we move on to Germany attacking the British over the Soviets. The Germans were at constant war with the British for 6 years straight. However, there were only aerial battles over England, which became referred to as the Battles of Berlin. The British proved to have the greater air force, which then caused Hitler to move east towards the Soviet Union. Now, what would have happened? In the scenario where Germany did not just launch an aerial attack, but instead a full-fledged offensive on England, you'd find that Germany would eventually conquer Great Britain. To begin, Hitler would attempt to invade the stronghold of Gibraltar to cut off the Royal Navy's operations there. Cutting a deal with Spain, he'd eventually assemble the manpower to attack. The attack would most definitely succeed, and the British would lose access to the Mediterranean. Hitler would then launch his aforementioned invasion of England, whether his advisors approved it or not. Sending in over 160,000 men to England with air and artillery support, they'd fight for nearly a year. However, Hitler would realize that this would not be enough manpower to take England. He'd then proceed to send in many more men, which would prove too great for England to handle alone. Therefore, the United States would come to the aid, meaning the Germans would require even more men, using nearly all the men they'd have, to attack England. The majority of World War II would actually take place on Great Britain and the English Channel, with the results beyond anything I could predict. The Soviets would most likely combat Japan, as they had assumed America and Britain could handle the Third Reich. The entire way we viewed the war could be changed simply by the decision of Adolf Hitler himself, proving how much power he had at the time. This alternate war would have caused much more damage to England and France, rather than Poland, Germany, and surrounding countries. Now we'll move on to Germany's attacking the Swiss. The Germans had initially planned to overtake Switzerland as early as 1940, soon after they conquered France. Hitler planned to use the Italians to flank the south, while the Wehrmacht advanced from the north. However, Hitler soon realized the growing threats of Britain and Soviet Russia, so he never initialized the attack. Now, what would have happened? Had the Axis powers gone through with the invasion, they would have only strained themselves to death. The Swiss country was mountainous and vigorous, making it very hard to navigate through. The Swiss had 400,000 men prepared to fight to the death, initially defending the borders and then retreating to the Alps to fight a guerrilla war. The Axis powers surely outnumbered the Swiss, however the fight would be long and draining, and in fact could have resulted in attrition warfare, eventually draining Germany to its collapse. This, however, is vastly unlikely due to the size of Switzerland and the massive amounts of Italian and German soldiers. However, the war would soon wither as the British/American forces, as well as the Soviet forces, surround Germany, overtaking the surrounding territories. This would leave Hitler's army forced to fight 3 enemies at once, which is something they simply couldn't do. The German forces would then surrender, ending the Second World War in as little as 3 to 4 years. There were small decisions that Hitler made early in the war which led to his defeat. By making absurd orders contradicting his generals' plans, the German offensive was stalled in Russia, which then led them to regather and regroup to eventually defeat the Reich at Moscow and again at Stalingrad, which wiped out major amounts of the German forces on the Eastern Front. In fact, the entire Sixth Army. This is what caused the Soviets' unstoppable advance towards Germany, leading to the surrender. And again at Britain. The German forces launched Operation Sea Lion, which was the air raid on England. The initial German plan was to destroy the severely unorganized ROF over Britain. However, a German air fighter accidentally dropped a bomb on London, which led to Churchill sending in a force to bomb Berlin. This heavily angered Hitler, and he ordered the Luftwaffe bomb smaller cities in England. This led to the RAF to recover and retaliate. Since Hitler did not wipe out England when he should have, they gained air superiority and went on to torment the Reich. These small things, had Hitler done right, would have led to outright success for the Third Reich. The Nazi Party would have conquered Moscow and London, leading to the eventual surrender of both countries. Shortly after, the US would realize war would be inevitable, so they declare war on the Axis powers. Fighting a double front, the Americans could do what they could, yet it's safe to say they'd eventually surrender as well. The Second World War was a disaster for the entire Earth and an embarrassment of human existence. Laid dead were nearly 50 million people in total, spanning from a third of the world's countries. To think that there are the smallest things that can be changed that would result in catastrophic outcomes, and that we avoided nearly all of these, is truly an astonishing thing. However, we know the greatest thing we did not avoid was the possibility of this war at all. There have been multiple occasions where Hitler was nearly killed, as a child and as a soldier. Had he died, the Nazi Party would have never gained momentum in Germany, and the world would have been spared from such devastation. And with that, I now end the video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know either via the comments or a like, and I will be able to make new episodes for the series on other topics. Now, thanks for watching, everyone, and I hope to see you soon.